Hello. So, The Nautilus Sanction by Simon Hawke. I'm actually rather woefully underprepared for this review. Usually I make notes and stuff, and sometimes I even have what's going to be the rough draft, of what's going to be my written review. Plus I've just come off night shift and I'm blurry tired. But I'm going to give this as a sort of first thoughts. So, the Nautilus Sanction was something I was really excited to find in the November book haul, because here is the Ivanhoe Gambit, the first one of the Time Wars series. I have had this very specific edition since I was about 13. I found it in a second-hand bookshop. I loved it. I read it. I reread it, sometimes more than once a year when I was a teenager, over and over again. I'm sure that Simon Hawke would be delighted to know this was one of the things that got me into history. I didn't know anything very much about Ivanhoe when I first read this. Reading this made me interested in the history of England, in the history of the whole knighthood system, and yeah, it got me into history. I know he'll like that because of the ending, the author's note in the Nautilus Sanction. Now, I'd kind of forgotten how much I loved the Ivanhoe Gambit. I never got rid of this book and I kept rereading it, but I never thought to go out there and look for Simon Hawke and more. I feel like at some stage I have read another book in this series, but I don't remember it well and I don't think I owned it. So I was kind of thrilled to own this one. Now, before we go much further, I want to remark on the cover, because the cover was something that I remarked on as soon as I saw it. A few years ago, I did a one-year challenge of reading literature and historical fiction that's famous. And that year was very, very instrumental in my enjoyment of the Nautilus Sanction for a couple of reasons. And the artwork is the first. As soon as I saw this book, I could see that this artwork, you can see here that the feet are vanishing as they phase in and out of time. There's a submarine in the background. And you probably can't see that there's a glint that makes it clear that he's got an artificial eye. What you can see is the vividness of the ship, the vividness of the ocean and sky, that sail, and those almost orthogonal lines make up the artwork. I recognize this artwork as mimicking a lot of the classic artwork that in the 1800s was often put together with the adventure stories such as Robinson Crusoe, the Swiss Family Robinson, etc. I did make notes that year, but I can't find them. So I fell down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I feel that it's possible that the artist that this cover is meant to be a, what's it called? That thing. Credit? Not a credit. A tribute. That's it. I think it's meant to be a tribute to the artist who did so much in the 1800s. I can't see anywhere in this book, I'm not saying it isn't there, just that I can't see it. The cover illustration is by Mark Harrison, who I don't know, and I think that the artist that he's trying to give credit to is Walter Paget. I'm not 100% certain, but Paget did a lot of work in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He worked on Defoe's work and a whole heap of other ones like H. Rider Haggard. And his artwork seems similar. I'd need to see some actual artboards because it's the colours that stand out in this style of art. Anyway, raving about the cover. On to the book itself. So, this is the fifth, and in some ways I think it would be important to many people to have read, if not all four previous ones, at least something. It was a slow starter for me, and it's not a large book. It's 195 pages. It took me a long time. It took me days. For a start, I was still recovering from Arthur C. Clarke and the horror that his last book was. But it's got a few characteristics that I didn't love. So it starts off with the chronology of the Time Wars. And that's 6 pages of details about the history of the Time Wars and how they worked. Now, that's the sort of thing that as a teenager I would have lapped up, but I can't see it in the Ivanhoe Gambit. I think this is a measure that Simon Hawke must have adapted later as the series continued. He also info dumps. In the first chapter or two, there's a huge info dump about the science behind time travel, and there's a couple of other ones later on. Didn't love the info dump. I don't actually have enough physics knowledge to be able to relate it to the real world physics. So I'm reading this and I wasn't in a position to Google at the time, so I'm not sure how much of this is real. Einstein obviously is real. A couple of the principles in there I'm pretty confident are real. Then it's talking about other things and I don't know if they are or they aren't. If you have better physics background and you have read this book, I'd be fascinated to hear what you thought about the info dump at the beginning. Given what a experienced and I'm going to say dedicated author Simon Hawke is, I suspect it's really very good and I just couldn't appreciate it. What I could appreciate though is the history. There is so much history. So the Time Wars, here I am raving on. So the thing about the Time Wars is that you've got this, the physics laid the way for people to go back in time, and then you ended up through a series of events that you can read in the front of the book if you really want to, with the Time Commandos. So Earth has got this thing where instead of having wars on Earth, they send participants back into the future, into the past, to fight in wars, and how they do and how they're rated affects the outcome of the dispute that is being settled. This isn't a unique theme to sci-fi. I've recently read another series where they did the same, but this is probably one of the better ones that I've read. It's a good concept. And in this advanced one, you've got the Time Commandos, who are the creme a la creme of all the soldiers that fight through time. And in particular, we've got 3 particular commandos that we've met before going back in time to meet a huge challenge. The challenge is a Russian super sub that was hijacked from the 2700s and has been pulled back into time, and it's sailing the oceans of the 20th century, I'm going to say. And it's causing havoc. The guy who's sailing it is a known thorn in the side of the Time Commandos. And don't believe anything you read about this book. The Goodreads description of it is just plain wrong. And as well as being like seven lines long. And I think there's only about 5 reviews of it. It's an exciting book, and it gets more and more exciting as you go through. The ending of it, there's a battle to defeat the bad guy and the submarine, but the ending is a very excellent, very exciting battle. It's a slow starter though. Again, if you haven't read the previous ones, I think you'll run into a problem with characterization. The Ivanhoe Gambit introduces you to Lucas Priest, who ends up being sent back to replace a knight who's just come back from Crusades. That particular knight has been hijacked and is being held ransom, and by doing so, someone plans to split the timeline. So what the Time Commandos mostly do is they try to prevent the timelines from being split so dramatically or something so strange happening that everything is affected. The reason for that, if I understand it correctly, and it doesn't really matter, this is a cowboys and Indians, bad guys, good guys type adventure. It doesn't matter, but my understanding of the reason why they try to prevent this is because they're bopping around back and forth in time all over the place. If the timeline is split, then you can't really be sure where you're going to and where you'll end up and where you're coming from. And that's a danger, because a lot of time soldiers who are sent back in time lose their technology and get sort of dumped out in time, which creates a whole heap of different political systems, which I'm not going to tell you about, several different organizations. Again, it's worth reading to find out. I do think you're probably best off starting with the Ivanhoe Gambit, and even if you don't plan to continue the Ivanhoe Gambit, for me, the Nautilus Sanction worked well as a standalone because I'd already met Lucas Priest in the Ivanhoe Gambit. I'd already met Andre Cross, who is a pretty awesome warrior woman, I'm going to say. She doesn't get a huge showing in this one, but her backstory is amazing. And there's also Finn Delaney. I've definitely met him somewhere before. I'm not sure if that was in another book that I read. All these three characters are great characters. And having reread the Ivanhoe Gambit for many years, I know them well. But if you don't already know them from a previous book, I'm not sure that you're going to get much of a chance to get to know them here. They're good characters, but I don't feel like Simon Hawke invests an awful lot of effort in making them appear unique here. I think they're established characters that you need to know before you go in. What else have we got here? So the Nautilus Sanction is called the Nautilus Sanction because the bad guy, whose name is Drakov, it's a great bad guy name, isn't it? Seriously is. He's the guy who hijacked this Russian nuclear super sub from the 2700s. He's got horrible plans afoot to split timelines, and he takes Lucas Priest, Andre Cross, and Finn Delaney captive. They're not having a good time trying to control it. They need to know where the sub is before taking it out of action. They can't take it out of action on their own because there's hundreds of sailors. They need to bring in their backup time commandos. It's a good story and has so many good things about it, and one of them is Jules Verne. So this is the other thing that my year of reading the classics gave me. I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and that was a great book. I don't remember enjoying it quite as much when I was a teenager and read it, but reading it as an adult, I absolutely loved it. One of the characters in this book is Jules Verne, who gets taken aboard this submarine. He's from his own era, and how he ends up on the submarine, I'm not going to tell you because, you know, the story is great, and I figure if you like classic sci-fi of any kind, you should probably just read it. But you've got Jules Verne throughout, and at first I did find him a slightly annoying character. And my characters, the ones I was already bonded with, I found them slightly flat as well. But it just got better and better. And because it's a slow read, and because there's so much in it, and because there's so much building up of the plot and of all the characters in it, it ends up being a really lush book. And if you look at it, and you read that it's part of a series called The Time Wars, and you read about Simon Hawke, who also authored some of the Star Trek books and stuff, you might get the feeling that it's pulp fiction. And it really isn't very pulpy. It's a very, very solid book. And it's a shame that so few people have read it. The dialogue is not bad, but the story itself is excellent. So, having read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea recently, and about Jules Verne, this became such a more rich book. The sub wasn't originally called Nautilus. It's been renamed Nautilus by Drakov, and this is kind of a spoilery thing to do, but I'm going to mention it anyway. I'm not going to mention the plot, I'm not going to mention the adventures, which are great, but I am going to mention the end. So at the end, when they've defeated the bad guy, which you can probably figure out really for yourself, because this is a number 5 in a series that I think stretches to 11. So there's bound to be more, right? They're back at base, and normally what they do when they get people from a past history stage and they have to return them to their history, they blank their minds so they're not aware of having been affected by future history. With Jules Verne, while he accepts that is going to be his future, when it got put to the referees, who are the people who referee time travel and so forth, they decided that Mr. Verne, being such an influential person in history, couldn't have his mind wiped because it might interfere with his writing skills. Now, early on in the book, I was a bit confused about something. I was confused about Jules Verne because he was being represented as an author, but the things that he'd written weren't things I was familiar with. So I later came to realise that Jules Verne went on this adventure in this book before he'd written the really famous ones that we all know. Anyhow, we're here at the end. He's back at base. Everyone's crowding around him getting his autograph because he's as famous in the 2700s as he is all through. And he had the news broken to him that he's not going to have his memory obfuscated, he's going to go back. And he says, then I'm going to be allowed to remember all of this, said Verne, brightening. That's right, said Colonel Forrester. But I cannot use any of my experiences in my writing, Verne said, the brightness fading into gloom abruptly. Well, that depends, said Forrester, choosing his words with great care. For example, if you were to write a book of fiction, suitably identifiable as such, about, a submarine, for example, so long as there was nothing in the book to actually enable anyone to build one, etc., etc. Anyway, Mr. Verne leaves the room, and there's a lot of Easter eggs for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in this, as well as many other things, I might add. And as they move away, Lucas Priest, who I was deeply in love with, by the way, at the age of 13 or something, says to his colonel, did I just hear you give him the idea to write 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? Don't be ridiculous, said Forrester. I didn't put him aboard that sub. Besides, a writer has to write from what he knows, didn't he? And Andre says, I think I just heard a hair being split. The narrative is really good. The dialogue can be really good. I really enjoyed it. And one more detail in the end, at the author's note. Although the Time Wars novels are historical science fantasy, it is my hope that readers, particularly young readers, might be interested enough to read the actual history some of these books are very loosely based on, as well as the classic novels which inspired them. Simon Hawke, you win. That's exactly what inspired me, both towards science and toward history. The Ivanhoe Gambit, that is. Many years ago. And he talks about a character that I have vaguely heard of but don't know too much about, but I'm willing to read more now, called Jean Lafitte, who was influential in early New Orleans history. He was a buccaneer, apparently, in what I think we would call the Caribbean now, and influential in American history at the time they were taking on the British Empire, I think. Which is what I have to say, there is so much in here. There's so much history, there's so much science, which I'm still dubious about. I don't know, I think it was probably pretty good. There's just so much to enjoy in this book. It's a crying shame that so few people seem to have read it. I'm about to head off in a day or two to the Lifeline Book Fest. If you see me there, wave, come over, say hi. I'm hoping to find more science fiction, like I need another book haul. I haven't gotten through all 200 I still have, but one of the things I am really keen for is to get the rest of the Time Wars in between number 1 and number 5, and apparently there's a whole heap more up to number 11 after that. So thank you for bearing with this completely unrehearsed review of the Nautilus Sanction, which ended up being a damn fine book and thoroughly worth reading. I'm going to hang on to it. If I manage to get the others, I might even try to read them in a series. I think they're good enough that you can do that. And yeah, like, comment and subscribe and all that algorithm stuff. What else? Read good books. That's what it's all about. Read good books, and if they're classic sci-fi, extra points for reading good books. Have a great day.